on the coast of Kent, where the sea had a habit of sounding like speech, even when no one meant to speak. March behaved as if it were only pretending to be winter. The waves still came with their damp authority, but the air carried that mild, cheating warmth that made a lady believe in improvement, if only for the day. The estate of Langford Haven sat among dunes and clipped hedges, its windows bright where the sun chose to strike them. Its drawing rooms furnished more for occupation than for emptiness. Yet emptiness, in the off-season, was what it largely was. Most of the great houses along the shore had emptied with the last ship's departure. A barouche might pass twice a week, an entire visiting party twice a season, and the Tun, when it remembered the seaside at all, preferred to remember it in April. Cecily had no particular desire to be remembered. She was the sort of woman who, when asked after her health, responded with intelligence rather than dramatics. When the local magistrate's wife insisted that a chill had settled in her bones, Cecily nodded as if she were considering the medical theory with seriousness, then went on to observe that the window seams were indeed draughty. When the curate declared the sea air wholesome, she replied that wholesome could mean either invigorating or merely undisturbed by propriety. Those small comments had earned her a reputation among the few who remained, an intelligence that was difficult to ignore, and therefore difficult to forgive. She lived at Langford Haven with her Aunt Isolde, who had once been the sharpest wit at a London assembly, and had since chosen to govern her household from a position of calm superiority. Isolde did not chase attention, and she did not fear it. She simply arranged it, like the silver at table. She had kept the house because it suited her, kept visitors because it was useful, and kept Cecily near her because it was safe. Safety, Cecily had learned, was not the absence of danger. It was the careful placement of danger where it could be counted. The first call of the week arrived in the form of a calling card slipped beneath the edge of the drawing-room door. It was an elegant thing, laid carefully as if it were too delicate for haste. The gentleman's name, in a hand that pretended at ease, read, Reginald Wrexham. Isolde did not look at the card as she received it. She read it the way a musician might listen to a tune she already knew. Wrexham, she said, and the word landed with the smoothness of a verdict. Cecily watched her aunt's fingers, dark gloves but the nails visible, each one filed and polished. The glove touched the card, turned it once, then set it atop a blotter as if it belonged there. "Do we know him?" Cecily asked. Isolde's gaze slid to Cecily, measuring not the question but the manner of it. "Not by acquaintance, by story. There is always a story in the Tun, even when there is no person attached." Cecily had learned long ago that Isolde could be maddeningly cryptic without ever becoming unclear. "Which story?" she pressed. Isolde's mouth curved by a fraction. "The story of a gentleman newly returned from the continent and newly resolved to be useful here. Useful to a seaside estate that is emptied too early." "A man who wants to be useful," Cecily repeated. "How rare. Does the Tun applaud that?" "They will if he becomes inconvenient. They will not if he behaves like a man. That is what makes him interesting." Interesting men were always dangerous in their way. The household had received other visitors during the first winter weeks, distant cousins with soft hands and sharper questions, neighboring widows with stories of their late husbands that began at the end and required no beginning. But Reginald Wrexham belonged to that new class of visitor that seemed to bring his own air of secrecy. The next morning, the sea fog lifted just enough to make the lawns visible, and yet not enough to make the world kind. Isolde permitted Cecily to receive him. It was not because Cecily had earned the privilege, though Isolde believed in the righteousness of merit. It was because Cecily could observe. And observation, in a household like theirs, was a form of protection. Reginald arrived exactly at the hour he ought to. He wore a coat in sober tones that did not attempt to flatter his complexion, and yet managed to make him look composed, as if composure were a garment he could tailor. His cravat was tied with a precision that suggested he had once been required to do things properly, and then had learned to do them for himself. His face carried the marks of restraint. There was a faint pale burn on his right wrist, a pale line that would be invisible to anyone who did not look at his hands. Cecily saw it the way one might notice a hidden seam in a well-made dress, not by accident, but by training. He bowed with a courtesy that did not invite familiarity. "Miss Langford," he said. Cecily returned the bow in a manner that would satisfy propriety without offering warmth. "Mr. Wrexham?" Isolde remained in her chair, positioned like a judge who had decided to observe rather than condemn. Reginald's eyes flicked once, only once, to Cecily's aunt, then returned to Cecily as if he had made a deliberate choice to honor her position as the one he was actually addressing. "I was told," he began, "that Langford Haven takes an interest in correspondence and in orderly domestic proceedings." Cecily's curiosity sharpened. "Who told you that?" Reginald smiled, not at Cecily's question, but at the implication underneath it. "A lady I met in Deal, whose name I would not presume to offer without permission." "A lady," Isolde said mildly, "is always a convenient source. It preserves a man from accountability." Reginald did not bristle. "Or it preserves the lady from being used as a weapon." Isolde's gaze sharpened. For an instant, Cecily saw a flicker of something like respect. Reginald continued, speaking with an ease that never quite became friendliness. "I am in want of lodging for a short period. The nearest houses are either occupied by tenants or abandoned in discourtesy. I am told yours remains hospitable, even when the rest of the shore has gone quiet." "Lodging," Cecily repeated. "You have arrived without notice?" He made a small gesture, as if acknowledging the accusation without apologizing for it. "My circumstances made delay sensible." It was a familiar phrase. Circumstances were always sensible when someone wanted time and refused explanation. Cecily did not ask for his circumstances directly. Instead, she chose the safest route to truth, the route that required etiquette. "What connection have you to Langford Haven?" she asked. Reginald did not answer at once. He looked past Cecily, not in rudeness, but in calculation, choosing which truth would land without causing scandal. "I have an acquaintance with your late neighbor," he said at last. Isolde's brows lifted. "Our neighbor is not late." Reginald's eyes met Isolde's, and for a moment his composure seemed to strain. Then he recovered, smoothly enough to prevent a servant from noticing. "My apologies," he said. "Then I have an acquaintance with the gentleman whose family once occupied the neighboring grounds." Cecily watched the shift. It was slight, but it was there. A man rewriting history to keep it consistent. "Would you like tea?" Cecily asked, because she wished to test whether his refusal would come from pride or from calculation. "I would," he said, "if tea does not require a chaperone of the sort that would oblige me to behave like a penitent." Isolde's smile was faint and dangerous. "It may oblige you to behave as you choose." The household served tea. Servants moved quietly. Outside, the sea complained against the shore. Reginald spoke less than he might have, but what he chose to say revealed that he listened. When Cecily mentioned the way a calling card left too quickly in the morning could be interpreted as impudence, he nodded as if he understood the meaning beyond the words. When Isolde asked about his travels, he offered details that sounded plausible: markets, promenades, evenings in a townhouse where the windows faced the water. Yet Cecily found herself waiting for the one detail that would be too specific to invent. He never provided it. At the conclusion of the visit, Isolde permitted him to depart with the understanding that he might be received again. Cecily remained behind after he had gone, waiting until Isolde had poured herself her own tea a second time. "Tell me," Cecily said, "why you let him call." Isolde's eyes remained on Cecily. Because even a lie may have a purpose. And because it is better to watch a lie in one's own drawing room than to hear its echo in the street. Cecily's fingers tightened around her cup. He is lying. Perhaps, Isolde corrected. A man may be mistaken without intending to deceive. But there are patterns, Cecily. He has the look of someone carefully arranging his identity. Cecily set her cup down. Then he is precisely as dangerous as you prefer. A danger that chooses to be tidy. Isolde allowed herself a short laugh. That is not the compliment you think it is. Cecily had no time to contemplate the nature of compliments, not when Reginald Wrexham returned the following day with a new calling card. Only this time, the ink was slightly darker, and the flourish in the signature did not match the handwriting of the first card. Cecily compared them while pretending to arrange a ribbon on a hat. It was a foolish habit. Comparing script was something a jealous wife would do in a novel, something a foolish friend would do in a scandal. Cecily did it anyway. The morning calls continued. Reginald did not demand long audiences. He offered brief, orderly visits. He sent arrangements for a small library in the front room, books purchased, not borrowed. He asked only for what was proper, the privilege of walking on the lawn in the early hours when servants did not stray. He seemed to understand the boundaries of propriety as if he had once enforced them. And then, at the end of the week, he asked Cecily for a private conversation. It was the sort of request that, if granted, would make a chaperone necessary. It was the sort of request, if denied, that would make a gentleman appear arrogant. Cecily saw immediately why he made it. Why? She asked him directly, with Isolde at a distance where she could hear if she wished. Reginald's mouth tightened. Because in private, the truth may survive. Cecily could have laughed. Truth is not a thing that needs privacy to survive. It either lives or it dies. In public, it merely becomes louder. Reginald looked down at his hands, then back at Cecily. Miss Langford, I am not here to perform kindness. And yet you perform it well, Cecily said. He drew a breath. I perform because it keeps me safe. And you consider me safe? Reginald met her eyes. There was no flirtation in his gaze, no hunger for conquest. Instead, there was something heavier. A man who had chosen a course and disliked the distance between his intention and its consequences. I consider you observant, he said. And observant women do not tolerate sloppy stories. That was the first time he had admitted plainly that he understood her. Isolde rose slowly behind Cecily, as if she had always been standing. If you have business, sir, speak it. If you have romance, take it elsewhere. Langford Haven does not manufacture scandal. It merely endures it. Reginald bowed to Isolde, and for the first time did not pretend he was merely a visitor. I seek, he said, to hire Mr. Langford's old clerk. He is not well. He keeps accounts. He also keeps records of certain parcels. Cecily's heart gave a sharp, unreasonable beat. It was not because she understood what parcels meant. It was because her father, long dead, long absent in the way that made his memory both safe and inconvenient, had once been associated with a different set of parcels, one that never quite left the house. Isolde's voice remained calm. Mr. Langford's clerk died last year. Reginald did not flinch, but the strain returned. Then the parcels are held elsewhere. Cecily watched his hands again. The burn-marked wrist was hidden under his cuff, but his gesture, his habit of covering it when he spoke, betrayed him. Why do you ask? Cecily asked. Reginald hesitated. Because if the parcels are found, the consequences may be unpleasant. That was a confession disguised as caution. Cecily felt her agency rise like a blade. Unpleasant for whom? Reginald's eyes narrowed slightly. For anyone who is adjacent to the person I have been pretending to be. There it was. A secret identity, not in the dramatic manner of disguises and masks, but in the quieter manner of names, addresses, and the careful theft of someone else's life. Cecily's mind raced through the Ton's habits. How quickly rumors traveled in town. How easily seaside guests became subjects for supper table speculation. How many of those speculations would become facts if a man supplied the missing bits with confidence? She had never been the sort of woman to wait for a scandal to arrive politely. "Then tell me," Cecily said, "who you are pretending to be." Reginald's gaze held hers, as if he were deciding whether truth was safer than strategy. "My name is not Wrexham," he said finally. Isolde's silence was immediate, sharp, and complete. Cecily kept her posture steady. "Then what is it?" Reginald's lips parted. For a moment, he looked like a man caught with his hand still in a drawer. He could not say it. He could only say, "I took the name after a man who did not return from the war in the way the newspapers promised." Cecily knew enough of newspapers to know they often promised what they could not verify. "So you stole it?" Reginald flinched, just once. "I borrowed it. I believed there would be time to put matters right." Isolde's voice was quiet. "And now?" Reginald lifted his eyes to Isolde. "Now I have run out of time." Cecily stared at him. "Who are the parcels for?" Reginald looked away, toward the window where the sea could pretend to be indifferent. "For me," he said, and the admission held a bitterness. "And for someone else who has been searching for me while believing I was dead." Cecily's imagination, impatient with propriety, began to map the consequences. A man declared dead. A wife or a sister or some other relative waiting for the truth to surface. The Ton did not care whether a man suffered. The Ton cared whether a woman's reputation could survive the story that would inevitably be told. If this were exposed, Cecily's own position would be affected by association. Not because she had done wrong, but because society punished women for being near the wrong men. She had always known that. It was simply more dangerous when the wrong man stood in her own doorway and spoke of his own ruin with an honesty that made the lie harder to hold. "Why come here?" Cecily asked. "Why this house?" Reginald's eyes returned to hers. "Because your aunt has connections. Because your household keeps records. Because you are not merely decorative." Isolde's mouth twitched. "Flattery. Useful flattery," Cecily corrected, and surprised herself with the calmness of her tone. Reginald's expression softened by a fraction. "You are accustomed to being dismissed." Cecily felt a sharp, unwelcome heat rise in her throat. She refused to let it become vulnerability. "Tell me what you need," she said, "and tell me what you cannot risk." Reginald looked startled at the offer of terms, as if a woman offering agency was not the sort of risk he had planned for. "I need," he said slowly, "access to a particular iron box. It was once kept in the study near the fireplace. It contains letters and accounts. If it is opened by the wrong party, my past will become public." Cecily's gaze flicked to Isolde, then back. "And if it is opened by the right party?" Reginald's voice quieted. "Then the person searching for me will learn the truth, and perhaps forgive me enough to let me be corrected." Cecily understood the flaw in his wording. Corrected was a word for ledgers, not hearts. And yet he spoke as if correction would be the only thing required. The truth was crueler. People rarely forgave without being changed. And change in Regency society often required scandal, public proof that someone had been wrong. She did not desire scandal. She desired an outcome she could own. "Very well," Cecily said. "You may ask for access. But you will not tell my aunt's servants to keep secrets on your behalf. You will not instruct any maid to pass messages.
You will not.
Reginald's brows rose. I would not dare. Cecily's eyes sharpened. Dare and do are not always the same. You will behave like a man who wants to be decent. Reginald let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. I want to be decent. There was the confession of a flaw. A man who had performed decency while hiding a sin, and who, in the presence of someone intelligent enough to see the seams, had begun to wish he could stitch them. Isolde cleared her throat, cutting the moment before it could become intimate. Then you will remain for supper. We shall have an arrangement with your questions. In the meantime, Mr. Whoever you are, you will accept my conditions. You will not go searching the house alone. Reginald bowed. As you wish. The off-season meant fewer eyes. The seaside estate still hosted the occasional gentleman on a walk, the occasional lady at a window, the occasional servant who turned curiosity into conversation. But fewer eyes meant even more attention when someone notable arrived. By the second week of Reginald's calls, the local gossip gathered like weather. At the market, women spoke too loudly over fish. In the small chapel, a man whispered at the side of his wife, as if he were offering God a new subject. In the coachyard, a coachman insisted, unprompted, that he had seen Reginald at an odd hour, speaking with a ledger clerk. Cecily did not demand silence. Demand only created resistance. Instead, she ensured that what gossip could not stop, it could not twist without cost. She arranged for Reginald's visits to remain proper. She asked him to call on days when Isolde hosted a particular kind of company, distant relations of impeccable boringness. If the tongue wished to whisper, it would do so among those who would repeat nothing. And then, almost as if the sea itself were conspiring, the letter arrived. A sealed note appeared on Cecily's desk one morning. The paper was fine, the wax stamped with a crest Cecily recognized from old legal documents. The mark of a family whose fortunes had been tangled in an inheritance dispute. Isolde examined it without touching it. Do not open it yet, she said. Cecily stared. Why? Isolde's voice was controlled. Because the sender knows we will open it. And because whoever sends a letter with such certainty often expects it to arrive with witnesses. Cecily's pulse quickened. Are you suggesting? Isolde nodded once. They wish to see whether you choose discretion. They wish to measure your obedience. Cecily's mind flashed to the callings card inconsistencies, to Reginald's careful rewriting of his own story, to the way he had spoken of the wrong party. Someone wanted her reaction. She took up her pen and wrote a brief reply to the sender, a reply that did not reveal her intelligence and therefore would not insult the sender. She instructed a servant to deliver it to the post without delay. Only after the servant departed did she open the letter. Inside, the handwriting was neat and severe. It informed Cecily that a man using the name Wrexham was due to be claimed by someone connected to the continent. It implied, with delicate cruelty, that she might be implicated if she had associated with him. It demanded that she ensure he left the coast immediately. Cecily read the letter twice before she understood the final line. It was not a threat made by a stranger. It was a warning made by someone who knew her aunt's habits, someone who knew how morning calls worked, how calling cards were kept, and how quickly scandal could be made from association. Her fingers trembled only slightly. She turned the letter over and noticed the slightest indentation in the wax, an impression from a seal that had been pressed before it was meant. She stared at it, then at the direction the letters had traveled. A private thought formed, unwelcome but necessary. The seal belonged to someone who had been in London. Not only in London, but close enough to use the crest as if it were theirs. Cecily's mind returned to the iron box Reginald had mentioned. It contained letters and accounts. If those letters were found, the truth might be corrected. And if those letters were seized by another party, Cecily's discretion would be punished. Cecily went to Reginald that evening. The light was golden, but the house felt emptier as the sun lowered. Isolde had taken herself to her room under pretext of fatigue, leaving Cecily to handle the problem directly. Reginald stood near the library fireplace, his hands restless at his sides. When Cecily entered, he did not smile. "You have received letters," he said. Cecily raised the note just enough to show she was not guessing. "So have you, it appears." Reginald's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Who sent it?" Cecily asked. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Cecily recognized the shape of his flaw. He did not lie to deceive her. He lied because he feared the consequences of truth. "I promised myself," he said, "that I would not bring you into my affairs." Cecily's eyes narrowed. "Yet you brought me into them the moment you used my calling card table as a hiding place." Reginald looked as if he had been struck. "I did not hide myself at your house to protect you from scandal. I hid myself to protect you from me." Cecily walked closer. The scent of sea salt and polished wood surrounded her. "Those are not different," she said quietly. Reginald's gaze followed her, caught on her face, then dropped to her hands. He looked, briefly, like a man who wished he could be forgiven before he had earned it. "What do they want?" Cecily asked. Reginald swallowed. "They want the story to end. They want me returned to the identity that can be accounted for. They want—" He stopped. Cecily waited. "They want my confession to become a legal matter," he finished, "not a moral one." Cecily's breath left her. "Legal matters do not care about pain," she said. "They care about proof." Reginald's eyes met hers. "Exactly." Cecily glanced toward the door that led to the study. "Then we must find the iron box first." Reginald started forward, as if her decision pulled him from a dream. "Tonight?" Cecily didn't flinch from the danger of timing. "Tonight, while the house is empty enough that we can move without servants gossiping. And while your reputation has not yet caught up with your lie." Reginald's expression tightened with guilt. "I cannot ask you to risk yourself." Cecily smiled without humor. "You have already asked. You have simply done it by existing." She led him, not into a forbidden corridor, but into the portion of the house her aunt used for storage. Isolde kept her keys where Cecily knew them to be. It was agency, not rebellion. When they reached the study, Cecily found the iron box where Reginald had claimed it would be, near the fireplace, tucked beneath a false layer of coal dust and ornamental stone. The discovery was immediate, and for that Cecily felt anger rather than triumph. If the box had been so carefully hidden by her father's memory, then someone else knew of it too. Reginald examined the box as if he could read his own past in its rust. "There," he said, and his voice cracked just a fraction. Cecily held steady. "What's your flaw?" she asked abruptly. Reginald looked up. "My flaw?" "Yes," Cecily said. "You speak as if you deserve correction without having to ask for forgiveness. That is a flaw." Reginald's mouth twitched. "Perhaps my flaw is that I am tired of begging." Cecily's heart ached, and she hated it for being moved. He pressed his thumb to the lock, then stopped. "I do not have the key." Cecily stared at him, stunned. "You did not?" He shook his head, eyes dark. "I needed access. I expected the key to be kept." Cecily understood with a cold clarity. He had not asked for the key. He had asked for access and hoped she would supply the rest. She felt a surge of anger at how plausible his lies had been. "Then you are not simply running out of time," Cecily said. "You are running from responsibility. You came here with a story and hoped it would carry you to the truth." Reginald's shoulders fell. "Yes," he admitted, "and I regret it." Cecily's gaze softened despite herself. Regret is not action. He looked at her as if she were a ledger with a single line that could not be erased. She reached into her sleeve, drawing out a small key Isolde kept for Cecily's use, a key she had been told never to use for anything that could lead to scandal. Cecily had never used it. "Then I suppose," she said, "we shall find out what is inside your past." Reginald's eyes widened. Cecily ignored the reaction. She fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a quiet complaint, and the lid opened. Inside were letters, folded and tied with faded ribbons, accounts with careful numerals, and one sealed envelope addressed to a woman in a hand Cecily recognized from somewhere she could not place. She lifted the envelope. "This is meant for—" Reginald reached for it too quickly. Cecily drew back instinctively, the way a lady did when a gentleman moved without asking. "Ask," she said, her voice gentle enough to be kind and firm enough to be respected. Reginald swallowed. "May I?" Cecily considered him, then offered the envelope into his hands. He broke the seal with shaking fingers. His face did something Cecily had not seen it do before. It went strangely still, like a man listening to a confession he had always expected and always feared. He read the letter in silence. When he finished, he looked up at Cecily. "She is alive," he said. Cecily's breath caught. "And the person sending the warning?" Reginald's eyes darkened. "Her guardian. A relation who believes she is better protected by lies." Cecily's mind moved quickly now, the way it did when confronted with an injustice that could be measured. If her guardian believes lies protect her, then the guardian will seize whatever proves the truth. They will attempt to force the correction through law. Reginald's jaw tightened. "Exactly." Cecily stared at the box contents, then at the letter. "Then we must do something law hates." Reginald blinked. "What?" Cecily's voice was quiet. "We must choose the order of events ourselves." She closed the box, tied the ribbons, and took the accounts into her hands. "We will go to my aunt in the morning. We will request a private meeting with the guardian's solicitor, properly. We will place this information where it can be used without giving the ton a spectacle." Reginald's expression shifted. "You intend to fight?" Cecily's smile returned, sharper than before. "I intend to prevent a foolish woman's life from becoming a courtroom play." Reginald looked at her as if she had said something intimate. The night could not become romance too quickly. A lie had entered their lives, and lies did not exit without leaving consequences. But in the study, with the iron box closed and secrets contained where they could be handled, Cecily allowed herself one private thought. If Reginald was not the man he claimed, then perhaps what she found attractive was not his identity at all. Perhaps it was his ability to be changed by her resistance. Morning came with the familiar ritual of calls. Isolde joined them in the drawing room with a composure that looked effortless, until Cecily noticed her fingers pressing into the arm of her chair. Isolde had known this would be difficult. She simply refused to admit it to anyone else. Reginald presented the sealed envelope, and Isolde read it with a careful stillness that could have belonged to a statue. When Isolde finished, she set the letter down. "There is someone," she said, "whose life will be impacted by this." Cecily nodded. "She is alive, and someone believes her guardian must control the story." Isolde's eyes moved to Reginald. "And you believed you could borrow a name without being found." Reginald's shoulders tightened. "I believed I could fix it." Isolde gave him a look that was not unkind. "Belief is not the same as plan." Reginald looked as if he might argue, but he didn't. Instead, he bowed slightly. "Then instruct me." Isolde's expression shifted, approval disguised as sternness. You will remain in the house. You will not go into town. If you require movement, you will go with a proper attendant. If you speak to anyone, it will be with witnesses enough to protect Cecily from gossip. Cecily bristled at being protected, but she understood why Isolde did it. Protecting Cecily was a way to protect Isolde's own authority. "And the guardian?" Cecily asked. Isolde's mouth tightened. "We shall meet him at a morning call." The man arrived promptly, because men who governed other people's secrets rarely possessed impatience. He was neat, soft at the edges, and his voice contained an assurance that he believed propriety justified his decisions. He introduced himself as Thaddeus Herrick, a name that sounded like a ledger page rather than a person. He offered a polite apology for the confusion that had placed his ward's concerns in the path of Langford Haven. Cecily watched him closely. "Confusion," she repeated, "is a word that suggests one has lost the correct route. I believe, Mr. Herrick, that you merely chose a direction convenient to your position." Herrick smiled, as if Cecily were a pleasant child. "Miss Langford, the world cannot function without guidance." Cecily's smile was thin. "And the world cannot function without truth either. You simply prefer one to the other." Isolde stepped forward. "Mr. Herrick, we have received letters. We are not obliged to keep them private if private keeps you comfortable." Herrick's gaze flicked to Reginald. "Then you have been misled by a criminal." Reginald's posture went rigid. Cecily felt the urge to intervene, not because she wanted to defend him from his accuser's cruelty, but because she recognized the trap. If Reginald was accused as a criminal in front of witnesses, Cecily's connection would become poison. Cecily refused to let that happen. She set the accounts on the table where Herrick could see them. "They are not the work of criminals," she said. "They are the work of ledgers that have been used too long by liars who prefer law to conscience." Herrick's smile faded by a fraction. "What do you want?" he asked, blunt now. Cecily answered before she could doubt herself. "We want the truth arranged in a manner that does not require a scandal." Herrick's eyes narrowed. "You cannot prevent scandal. It is created by curiosity," Cecily finished. "And curiosity thrives when people feel entitled to the story. You do not feel entitled to our story." Isolde's voice softened into something like persuasion. "Mr. Herrick, if you insist on public correction, the ton will oblige you. But if you accept private settlement, you may avoid it. Your ward deserves peace." Herrick stared at them, calculating. At last, he said, "I will agree to a private hearing." Cecily's heart surged with relief and resentment. Relief that the worst would not become immediate spectacle. Resentment that peace required bargaining. Reginald remained silent throughout. After Herrick departed, Cecily looked at Reginald. "You wanted correction," she said. "Now it will become yours, whether you deserve it or not." Reginald's eyes met hers. "I deserve less than I ask, but I cannot endure being asked to leave her alone with lies." Cecily's voice softened despite herself. "Then you will endure whatever comes." That evening, the Tun's whispers reached their drawing room in pieces, like a storm brought through shutters. A lady called with excuses and an eager curiosity. A gentleman on the neighboring terrace insisted, too casually, that he had heard Reginald had asked for private rooms in a lodging house. Cecily watched the way Isolde handled it, politely, with cold precision. Isolde did not defend Reginald. She corrected the narrative without appearing to care. "I cannot speak to where a gentleman prefers to keep his letters," Isolde said to the nosy lady. "But I can speak to where Langford Haven prefers its guests. They remain under observation." It was not a denial. It was a warning. As the days passed, Cecily and Reginald became more honest with one another, not because they had confessed everything, but because they had begun to accept that their secret could not remain contained forever. Still, the romantic tension built in the smallest moments. The way Reginald helped Cecily arrange calling cards without making it seem like charity. The way Cecily corrected his pronunciation of a foreign village name when he claimed he had never lived abroad. The way he apologized when he used her father's old accounts too quickly. And yet his flaws remained. His flaw was that he did not trust his own redemption. He still expected Cecily to bear the consequences of his choices. He still spoke as if her restraint was proof of his decency rather than her own goodness. One afternoon, after a morning call that had gone poorly, an acquaintance of Isolde's had produced rumors with too much relish, Reginald approached Cecily in the corridor leading to the drawing rooms. "I am leaving," he said. Cecily stopped mid-step. "Leaving?" "Yes," he said, "before I damage you further." Cecily turned and faced him fully. "You cannot decide that for me." Reginald flinched, and for once the flinch looked like genuine hurt. "I am trying to save you." "You are trying to spare your guilt," Cecily returned. "There is a difference." Reginald's eyes darkened. "What would you have me do?" Cecily drew a breath. "Stay. Let the correction happen with witnesses. Let the story be handled properly. If you do not have the courage to remain, do not claim you wish to be corrected." Reginald stared at her. Cecily continued, voice quieter. "And do not speak of saving me as if I were a fragile item. I can endure. I can choose. I can decide whom to trust." Reginald's expression changed then, not into a smile, but into something like surrender. He stepped closer, slowly, as if asking permission with his body. "Then trust me," he said. Cecily's throat tightened. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe the man in front of her could be more than the sum of his stolen name. But trust required proof, not only confession. She reached out, not to touch his wrist. She hesitated there, remembering the burn mark and what it implied. But to place her hand lightly over his forearm, an understated gesture that would not become public romance. "I will," she said, "when you stop hiding behind the idea that I am safer than the truth." Reginald closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. "Very well," he said. "I will speak my true name to you." Cecily's breath caught. "Now?" Reginald hesitated. "Now, if you will allow it." Cecily nodded. "Speak." Reginald's voice lowered, and with it, something inside Cecily shifted from suspicion to recognition. "My true name," he said, "is Edmund Vale." The name was not as grand as Wrexham. It did not sound designed for seduction. It sounded like a man who had once lived plainly and then had been forced to reshape himself. Cecily held his gaze. "Edmund Vale," she repeated. Edmund's jaw tightened. "Yes." Cecily considered the new information. A stolen name, a real one revealed, an identity now claimed by the truth. "And what flaw remains?" she asked, trying to regain her usual composure. Edmund's mouth curved faintly, not quite a smile. "The same one. I still think I can control outcomes." Cecily nodded. "Then control will be taken from you." Edmund looked as if he had expected that. The private hearing took place in London because scandal needed distance to become manageable. Yet it was held not at a grand court. Isolde had arranged a chamber at a solicitor's office, discreet enough to avoid the gaze of every curious cousin. Cecily traveled with Isolde. Edmund traveled with an attendant chosen by Isolde, a man whose loyalty was purchased with a combination of money and moral sternness. Edmund's reluctance to go was immediate. He looked like a man forced to walk onto a stage, yet he complied. In London, The tone's machinery ground slower than in the countryside. Here, everyone expected everyone else to be involved in something. Gossip was a sport, and the off-season had not made it kinder. At a distance, Cecily could already imagine the whispers. A lady from a seaside estate linked to a gentleman of questionable identity, a confession whispered in a chamber, a guardian forced to swallow his own arrogance. But Cecily could do more than endure rumors. She could steer them. Isolde instructed her on what to say and what to allow. Cecily did not resent it. It was, in fact, assistance. When the solicitor read the gathered accounts aloud, Cecily watched Edmund's face with careful attention. He listened like a man who expected punishment and hated the delay. The ward, a woman named after a spring flower, appeared only briefly, escorted. Cecily did not need to see her for long. The ward's eyes carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had been denied truth. When asked whether she wished to confront Edmund, she hesitated, then nodded. Not in anger, in grief. Edmund stepped forward. The room held its breath. He did not attempt to charm. He did not attempt to justify every lie. He offered what he had always avoided: responsibility. "I was wrong," he said. "I took what I thought would be useful. I believed usefulness could erase theft. I was a fool." The ward, her name spoken only once by the solicitor, spoke in a voice so calm it was almost unbearable. "You were a coward," she said. Edmund's shoulders tightened. "Yes." Cecily watched as Edmund accepted the cruelty without bargaining. It was the first time his flaw had been corrected by a choice he made, not by a consequence imposed. The guardian, Herrick, tried to make the outcome a legal win. Isolde refused to allow it. Cecily provided the missing documents and ensured the narrative would not be twisted. At last, the matter concluded with a private settlement. Edmund was not ruined publicly. The ward's name remained intact, and Cecily, through her own intelligence, was not left to carry the stigma alone. Yet the consequences for Cecily's heart were private. Because when Edmund returned to Langford Haven, days later, looking quieter and more tired, as if he had been hollowed and refilled, the first thing he did was call on Cecily alone. They stood in the conservatory, where the sea air softened through glass and vines. The world outside was still empty enough for whispers to wander without witnesses. Edmund did not offer a grand proposal. He had learned not to ask for miracles. He simply looked at Cecily and said, "I owe you a truth that is not legal." Cecily's throat tightened. "Then speak it." Edmund's gaze held hers, and his voice was raw. "I have wanted you since the first day you corrected my story. I have wanted you through every act you performed to keep propriety intact. And I have been too proud to admit it without expecting you to pay for my pride." Cecily's eyes stung. She forced herself to remain steady. "And now?" Edmund took a breath. "Now I ask you to choose me without pretending I am different. You know what I did. You know I lied. You know my flaws are not cured by remorse." Cecily exhaled. "Then what do you offer?" Edmund's answer was quiet and terrible in its sincerity. "I offer my name," he said. "All of it. The truth. And I offer to earn your trust, not to demand it." Cecily stared at him. She could have refused. She could have insisted on caution. She could have protected herself by keeping her heart locked, calling that prudence. Instead, she chose the more difficult courage, the choice that required her to be seen. "Edmund Vale," she said, and the use of his true name sounded like a vow. "If you can continue to accept responsibility without expecting me to carry it, then I will consider a future that does not require me to shrink." Edmund's eyes brightened, then dimmed again with humility. "Consider it then," he said. "Not as a test, as a promise." Cecily's smile was small, but it held warmth at last. A promise requires action, not only words. "I will act," he said. "I will ask Isolde for permission properly. I will make myself acceptable by work, not by borrowed names." Cecily stepped closer, letting her hand find his, briefly, carefully, on the back of his wrist where the burn mark lived. His body stilled, as if he feared the touch would confirm his guilt. "It is not your burn that worries me," she said softly. "It is your habit of leaving before you are asked." Edmund's voice lowered. "Then do not ask me to leave." Cecily's heart surrendered a fraction. "Very well," she said. "Stay. And if the tongue whispers, we shall allow it to whisper about something worth repeating. A lady who refused to be silenced, and a gentleman who learned how to be honest." Edmund's breath caught. The sea beyond the conservatory glass sounded like applause. When they returned to the house, Isolde received the news with her usual calm. Calm that, in this case, softened around the eyes. "I should have expected you," she told Cecily, "to choose intelligence rather than ease." Cecily glanced at Edmund. Edmund's gaze met hers. Steadier now, not perfect but corrected by choice. "I," Isolde added, voice almost wry. "I suppose I must accept that I raised my niece not to be rescued, but to rescue her own future." Cecily laughed quietly, the sound private enough to be hers. In the weeks that followed, the calling cards changed. Reginald Wrexham disappeared from the paper like an ink smudge wiped away. Edmund Vale reappeared, properly introduced through morning calls, with an attendant chosen by Isolde and a story aligned with truth. The Ton continued to gossip, because the Ton always did, but Cecily's reputation did not collapse. It sharpened. At the next season's appropriate gatherings, Cecily did not pretend she had been innocent. She did not need to. She had been intelligent and stubborn and brave enough to steer the scandal away from becoming a sentence. And Edmund, no longer hiding behind borrowed names, learned to ask for what he wanted, without making Cecily pay for it. Their love did not arrive as fireworks. It arrived as something rarer. A quiet, period-appropriate resolution built from honesty, careful propriety, and two people who had earned the right to be seen together.